following is a CUNY TV special presentation.
Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is the second of a 5-part City Talk series on immigration, the paramount domestic issue facing the United States today. The discussion around immigration tells us much about who we are as a nation and who we want to be. In part 1, we talked about citizenship and the law. Today's subject, domestic violence, will be followed by conversations on family immigration, education, and federal and state legislations. These shows will run from April 30th through May 4th, and they will coincide with the 5th annual Daily News CUNY Citizenship Now call-in. Joining me as co-host, guest, and commentator for this series is Alan Wernick, a professor of law at Baruch College and chair of CUNY's Citizen and Immigration Project. His column, Immigration Advice, appears in the Daily News twice a week. Alan is also the author of U.S. Immigration and Citizenship, Your Complete Guide, and it's in its 4th edition. Our guests today are Yolanda Jimenez, Commissioner of the Mayor's Office to Combat Domestic Violence, and Julie Dinnerstein from the Sanctuary for Families at the Brooklyn Justice Center. Welcome back, Alan. Welcome back, Commissioner. Welcome back, Julie. First question is the extent and nature of domestic violence problem in New York, particularly among immigrants, but about New Yorkers overall. Commissioner?
Well, but in terms of New Yorkers overall, unfortunately, this is still a very pervasive issue in our city, in our country, and in the world. In New York City, we estimate that on any given day, police officers respond to an average of 600 domestic violence incidents across the city. Now, this could be something from a verbal dispute to something more serious. We also operate a hotline that gets about 400 calls a day as well. So we can potentially be talking about 1,000 people seeking some sort of assistance, some sort of help in domestic related incidents.
And you and I have worked for you on a pro bono basis coming out of the mayor's office. There are real cultural and language barriers with immigrants, and domestic violence seems to be not only dramatically underreported among the general population, but particularly so among immigrant groups.
Absolutely, and I think it's probably having to do with the fact that immigrant communities may be conflicted about this issue in terms of how they define the issue, what they bring from back home, how they might not see this issue as a crime, quite frankly. They may be fearful if there's an issue of immigration, of their own immigration status in terms of reporting and going to the authorities. There may be shame, and we know that just from any domestic violence victim that may feel that this is something that she should not be sharing with others. And so we have to be able to get beyond the cultural and linguistic barriers. We have to be sensitive to those issues, be knowledgeable of those issues, so that those that are responding, whether it's the police, whether it's the medical community, whether it's any community service, that they understand that these are real barriers for many of these victims.
Julie, you see these folks on the ground. What is the nature of the types of situations that you come across, and how do you deal with them? What's the nature of your involvement or your organization's involvement?
So we work with a lot of women who have been afraid to come forward, afraid to reach out. All of the domestic violence victims I'm working with are immigrants. And immigrants are scared of the police, they're scared of the courts, they may be scared of other institutions in the city of New York that are here to protect them. One of the most important things that we talk to people about, and one of the most important messages to get out is that all domestic violence victims can contact the city and don't need to worry about immigration. We are protected by Executive Order 41, which says that, among other things, crime victims, crime witnesses, and other people reaching out social services will not be reported to immigration authorities. A crime victim can safely call the police, whether it's domestic violence or any other crime, and seek help.
It seems that the city has a sophisticated, nuanced, and sensitive approach to immigrants in general, but victims of domestic violence in particular. Is that your sense?
Absolutely. I think New York City is doing a wonderful job in doing outreach to immigrant victims of domestic violence and in providing culturally and linguistically sensitive services. And these efforts continue to grow. The Brooklyn Family Justice Center, which is part of the Mayor's Office to Combat Domestic Violence, is an excellent example of services provided to immigrant victims. An immigrant or any other person, a citizen as well, can walk into the Family Justice Center any day of the week and say that they need help. It's a straightforward, anybody can come in, it's a walk-in service, and there are a lot of services there.
What do you see? I mean, what are the types of cases that you see? And the cultural elements, as the Commissioner talked about, what are you seeing?
It's across the board. We serve many recent immigrants who come to the United States, and as soon as they find out there's protection from an abusive situation that they may have been living with for years, they leave. So a number of my clients leave the first year in the United States because where they came from there wasn't protection from domestic violence, and here in the United States they find out that there is protection. That's a wonderful thing. Other people come to our office when they can't take it anymore. There may be ongoing abuse, community pressure not to tell anyone, and at one point they say it's too much. Often it's when the children start to be involved, when the children are affected.
Now, your agency interacts with numerous city agencies. The agency that I'm most familiar with that you interact with is the police department, and you interact with the DAs. Can you talk about generally the nature of your interactions and maybe talk a little bit specifically about police and those communities?
The issues that Julie talked about that a domestic violence victim may face cut across so many different services that can be provided by police, by the courts, social services, and so the idea is for my office to work with many of these agencies and to coordinate. We basically see each city agency as sort of having a piece of the puzzle, and when we put the pieces together, that's when we're most effective. Which is really sort of what we're trying to do with the Family Justice Center, this initiative that the mayor announced a year ago, basically trying to make sure that everybody's working together, get everyone under the same location. We have 2 wonderful police officers at the Brooklyn Family Justice Center. We have a probation officer. We have somebody from the Department for the Aging. We have all these agencies that have come together and so are able to provide those services to this client. The client doesn't have to go to 5, 6, 7, 8 different organizations. The police department has a unit, a domestic violence unit. Every precinct has domestic violence prevention officers that follow up on the cases.
And this is every precinct has these officers.
Yes, these very well-trained, dedicated officers that are there to follow up on the incidents that I talked about.
As I recall, when we did work together, one of the major problems was a lack of understanding on the part of the immigrant victims and abusers of the necessity for mandatory arrest, and not only subject to immigrants, all parties of domestic abuse, and that was part of the problem, that they didn't understand the nature of the rules. How do you teach those and to avoid those conflicts?
I think education is key, but education is key both for those that are providing the services, for the police, and we work together and collaborated on trying to bring in those cultural and linguistic issues that clearly will arise when police respond to a household, but also educating the community about the role of the police, educating the community about the fact that the city wants to protect victims of crime and certainly victims of domestic violence.
Have you noticed increased awareness and ability and willingness to engage the police in your tenure, but both of your tenures?
I think yes, and what we've seen is, for us, if reporting increases, that is something positive, because we want people to call the police. We had a campaign, a domestic violence awareness campaign, about 2 months ago. The first day of the campaign, the city received 1,000 calls. We usually average 400 calls. This particular campaign was in fact targeted to immigrant communities. We did the placement in strategic areas throughout the city that saw high incidence of domestic violence, but also where we know that there's underreporting taking place, because I think it hit home in conveying the essence of what we want, and that is, don't underestimate the level of risk that you're in.
Okay.
You may be in a situation that you think is going to get better, that you think, hopefully it will just evolve into something, or he will leave. But what we know all too often, unfortunately, particularly in the most serious cases when there's a homicide, is that there was no prior reporting to police. So we want to encourage people to report to police. We want to encourage people to get the help that they need. We want to encourage them to come to centers like the Family Justice Center, where they can see an immigration attorney if there's an immigration issue. We've seen an increase in the number of filings, and Julie can talk a little bit more about this in terms of petitions, U visas and self-petitions. We've seen that over the last year. We've had 140 filings for U visas and over 80 filings for self-petitions. These are remedies that are afforded to a domestic violence victim.
Okay, and does that come out of the VAWA Act,
Yes.
the Violence Against Women Act? Alan, you just lay out what that act does, and then Julie, I know you've done work with it and on it and written about it. Talk about that act and the protections that it gives, and the protections that is still further needed.
Thanks, Doug. Before getting into that, I just wanted to remind people about the CUNY Daily News call-in, and we're very thankful for the Daily News, co-sponsoring this 5-part series. The call-in is running. If people look to the bottom of their screen, they're going to be able to see the phone numbers. They'll also see a website, which they'll be able to get more information about it. So I really encourage people. We're in a situation where anyone can call in. It's totally anonymous, and they can get expert advice from people who are leaders in their field. The Citizenship and Immigration Project that I chair, I first started doing work in this area within the university at Ostos Community College, which is at that time was about 80% women and about 70% foreign-born. And we set up, we saw that there was a problem of women who, in particular, who were victims of domestic violence. And the law at that time was that if your spouse withdrew a petition or wasn't willing to support your petition, it basically meant the end of the road, which meant that you were a virtual slave to your husband. And so finally, after a tremendous amount of advocacy from all over the country, in 1994, Congress passed a law called the Violence Against Women's Act, VAWA as you refer to it. And it's designed to provide some protection for immigrant women so that they're not in this slavery kind of situation, and that now, at least under this law, if they meet certain criteria, which Julie will be able to explain to us, they will be able to self-petition. That is, they can get permanent residence without their spouse following through in the process for us. So it's Julie is really one of our leading experts in the country on this issue, and I think should be great for her to tell us a little bit more about this Violence Against Women's Act and what kind of protections it provides.
Absolutely. So the self-petition, the VAWA self-petition, is a really important remedy for people who are married to U.S. citizens, lawful permanent residents, people who are the children of citizens or lawful permanent residents, and finally a new remedy, people who are the elderly victims of adult U.S. citizens. So now victims of elder abuse, as well as intimate partner abuse and child abuse, can be eligible for the VAWA self-petition. What you need to have is a legal relationship with your spouse, who's a citizen or green card holder, your parent, who's a citizen or green card holder, or if you're an older person, your adult child who's a U.S. citizen. So the first thing is that you must have the legal relationship with somebody who's a citizen or green card holder. And then the next thing is that you have to have suffered abuse. What's really important for people to realize in terms of the abuse that you must have suffered is that you must have you have no requirement to have called the police. There's no requirement that you've gone to court. There's no requirement that you've gone to the hospital. So victims of abuse frequently don't reach out to systems because they're afraid to contact the police or the courts. It's important that all immigrant victims know that the courts and the police are there for them, that the hospitals are here to protect everyone and to provide services to everyone. But for people who have not previously reached out, they're still going to be eligible for this remedy. This remedy, once you establish your relationship with a citizen or a spouse who's abused you, it puts you on the path to lawful permanent residence. And lawful permanent residence, again, is the technical name for a green card. So it puts you on the path to getting a green card.
And of course, it's called the Violence Against Women's Act, but it's of course a men
gender
benefit
neutral.
to it as well.
Absolutely.
It's gender neutral.
It's gender neutral. The majority of victims, of course, of intimate partner violence are women, but men who are the victims can petition as well.
So what would be the procedure? Let's say somebody, a woman is a victim of, is married to a permanent resident or U.S. citizen. They're a victim of domestic violence. Her spouse, her husband is not willing to go through the immigration process. Could you just walk us through a little bit of when somebody comes to seek the legal assistance that is provided, what's the process? How do they go from the beginning of the process until they become a permanent resident?
Absolutely. So a person who is a victim of domestic violence starts out working usually with an immigration attorney at, for example, at Brooklyn Family Justice Center, where I work.
And the services are free there, are they
Our
not?
services are free.
And you funded? How does that relationship work? And then I'm sorry for the interruption.
Well, that was New York City was very fortunate in being part of a 15 cities across the country. There are 15 sites that the Department of Justice funded to create this. This was a very competitive process. There were 150 applications, but we were selected, and I think we were selected because we had the unique partnerships with the various community-based organizations that are now part of the center and are providing these great services all in this one place.
Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Please.
So the first thing that the immigrant victim of domestic violence is going to need to do is to tell her story. She usually is going to write a story with the help of a lawyer, is going to tell her story. It's usually 15, 20 pages, a long, detailed story. How did she come to be married? What kinds of abuse did she suffer? What's happened? And that's really the central piece of evidence, is the victim's own story. Then other evidence will be gathered, other written evidence. We'll reach out to other people who may know about the abuse or the problems, friends, clergy, maybe school officials, employers, anybody who might know.
I've heard that the Immigration Service can be pretty tough on applicants in terms of what kind of proof beyond their own statement that they can provide to establish that in fact they have been abused.
The standard is any credible evidence. It's a very broad standard. You want to be sure that all of the evidence that you have about your domestic violence situation is gathered together. Everybody who knows should be interviewed, should be providing statements. If you have contacted the police, the courts, the hospitals, you're going to want to include that. Whatever you have, you put together. But I always say, if it's true, then we can find a way to prove it. And you gather all of these documents together and you submit them to an office in Vermont, immigration office that's located in Vermont. That office is specially trained in domestic violence and will review your application. When the application is approved, you're granted something called deferred action. This is going to allow you to stay in the United States until you're eligible to apply for a green card, until you receive a green card. It's going to allow you to get a work permit, so you're eligible to work while you're waiting. In New York State, it's going to make you eligible for certain public benefits, including cash assistance and medical assistance under New York State social service law.
And it's also in the mayoral executive order.
Mayoral executive order is important because it says that people who work for the city cannot be contacting immigration in most circumstances. In addition, we have very good state laws and good case law on our state law saying that medical assistance is going to be available for people who are in these situations, and cash assistance under our safety net assistance program. So that's the first step, is having the self-petition approved. When your self-petition is approved, you can then apply for a work permit, which you can renew every year until you get a green card. People who are spouses of United States citizens, parents of U.S. citizens, and children of U.S. citizens can apply for a green card right away. In fact, they can file their self-petition with their green card application at the same time, and they are able, usually within a year of approval of self-petition, to have a green card interview here in New York and to get a green card. people who are spouses of green card holders or children of green card holders, whether they're in a domestic violence situation or whether they're in a happy family situation, for those people, they have to file the first part of the petition, in this case, the domestic violence petition, and there's a waiting line that can be anywhere between about 5 and 7 years until it's their turn to apply for green card. If you're a domestic violence victim, while you're waiting online until it's your turn to apply for a green card, you're able to get a work permit every year, and you're able to get deferred action, which again gives you access to public benefits, means that you're lawfully here in the United States, even though you don't quite have a green card.
And just one more point I want to clarify, because I get a lot of letters from readers about whether they can interview here or whether they have to go home for their interview. And my understanding is that people whose petitions are approved as victims of domestic violence, regardless of how they enter the United States or their legal status, they're going to be able to interview here. Is that correct?
That's correct. There are a number of special provisions that allow immigrant victims of domestic violence, even though they have previous immigration violations for entering the United States without permission, or they may have worked here, they may have stayed after their visa expired. Normally, people who have done one of those things have more trouble getting a green card here in the United States, but there's a special exception for domestic violence victims.
What needs to be done on the city level? I mean, you've done a lot. The mayor's done a lot. There's a lot of interagency coordination. What are the areas that remain to be done from the city's point of view? And then we'll talk about state and federal levels as well.
We have an opportunity at these centers, and by the way, the mayor's committed to opening 2 additional centers, one in Queens, which has a very large immigrant population,
Absolutely.
and one in the Bronx. But in addition, we have an opportunity at the center not only to see the victims, but to see children. And to be able to address the needs of these children who clearly have witnessed the violence at home is also critical. And we're doing a program right now through through some funding that we received through the Joe Torre Foundation that will allow us, and has allowed us, to provide this counseling for children. There are other issues that victims of domestic violence also present. There are mental health issues, there's substance abuse issues. We tend to see this issue as a criminal justice issue, but it's a health issue as well. It has health consequences for women, mental health, reproductive health. And so the health department has also made this issue one of the 10 focus issues to make sure that we have healthier New Yorkers. So when the whole We Take Care New York campaign, one of those issues, one of those areas to improve health is to make sure that there is a safe home in which both children and women and everybody can reside in. And we can't underestimate the effects and the health effects that victims may be undertaking. So we're also working with the health community. We talked about educating police. We've also worked in terms of educating health professionals, because if we're talking about victims who present and who have cultural issues in terms of how they may talk about this particular issue that's happening to them, doctors need to know that. Doctors need to understand that, if the husband comes into the room, the likelihood is you're not going to be able to ask that woman, what is really happening? Has he hurt you? Has somebody else hurt you? Why are you, having so many headaches, or whatever issues are taking place? And so this is very important to educate those that are providing the services so that they may be able to detect and identify. We want providers to detect and identify, and we also want victims and encourage them to disclose. That's also a very critical issue for us.
Excellent. Let's look at VAWA. What can be done at the federal level? What amendments, what additions do you see as both necessary and possible, if I may use those 2 words in the same phrase?
Okay, well, one of the most important things is there's another remedy that comes under the VAWA Act that we haven't had a chance to talk about yet. This remedy is called the U visa. Earlier, I talked about the self-petition. The self-petition is based on a marriage or a parent-child relationship with a citizen or a green card holder. Many times people are victims of domestic violence at the hands of people, either they're their intimate partner, they're not legally married, or maybe the person who's abusing them is not a citizen or a green card holder. So there has to be another way for people to seek help and ultimately gain stability here in the United States and get green cards. So in the year 2000, then President Clinton signed into law a law creating U visas. U visas are visas for crime victims of a list of crimes, which includes domestic violence, sexual assault, rape, similar crimes like that, who are victims of crime, suffer substantial harm, and who cooperate with the investigation or prosecution of the crimes committed against them. A very important feature for all of us in society, that crime victims feel free to come forward and cooperate with the investigation and prosecution. Unfortunately, this visa, which would ultimately lead to green cards for 10,000 victims a year would be eligible for this visa, has never been put into place. The government, this is now going into the 7th year after this visa was created by law, has never yet put this visa into place. So what's happening? What's happening right now is the government, knowing that they need to put this visa into place and not doing it, is allowing people who at least make out a prima facie case, who look like they're going to be eligible for this visa. The government is now allowing people at least to get work permits, deferred action status to stay in the United States, and work permits. So this is a really important start. But what the government needs to do is actually put these visas in place. Okay. And what I just need to say, to just close, is that Sanctuary for Families is among half a dozen agencies across the country who's actually suing the federal government, seeking in federal court for the court to force the government to follow the law.
What do you see over the next 2 or 3 years in terms of governmental action? What would you have an unlimited budget. What's the first 2 things you spend on?
We don't have an unlimited budget, but
I'll throw you a couple of tens of millions of dollars.
If that's the case. I think enhancing and building on what we have at these centers. What we're doing at these centers is simply connecting the dots, putting everybody in place who can provide the different pieces of services. Julie and her staff provide a critical service, as we just heard, to immigrant victims in terms of legal remedies, but there are there's other assistance, counseling services, medical services that clearly a victim of domestic violence needs. Housing services is a critical issue for many victims who have to flee their home. We have shelters, we have transitional housing, but permanent housing is an issue as well that we're working on and pursuing.
Thank you. Alan, final word?
I'm so pleased, as an advocate, I've been pleased over the years to see that so much has been done since when I first started getting involved in immigration issues here about 20 years ago. And I want to also remind people that they can call in to the Daily News at the numbers that are on your screen and at the bottom, and also that our website is www.cuny.edu/citizenship-now. And that's an ongoing effort. Our website will constantly be updating with new information. You can also get information about our shows this week.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank
you, Julie. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please join us tomorrow for part 3 of this 5-part City Talk series on immigration. Alan and I will be talking about family immigration with Midori Hills, the directing attorney of the CUNY Citizenship and Immigration Project, and Enzo Soderini, a paralegal there, and a couple who were assisted by the CUNY Citizenship and Immigration Project.